We can
Hey. Nice to see you here.
And Gemma, to give you an overview at the moment,
Take a seat.
you see, there is Anna Carla and Shiam. They are also part of the team, of course, and they are at the moment dislocated. One is in Italy and the other one is in Japan. So we are all a bit scattered in this phase of our own work and researches. There's the other bits of the PhD cohort, which is also scattered in their visiting research periods abroad. So it's a bit of a of a weird critical phase at the moment. So we never see each other in person lately. So
Hello.
hopefully
Yeah.
the next
And
event.
Maybe we
Where
can
are you,
start-
Elena?
I am in Italy too, actually.
Yeah, in
Yes.
Italy.
Yeah. At the
Okay.
moment, yes, I am.
Yeah. But between Italy and Delft now, basically.
Yes, exactly.
And Switzerland.
Yeah, there's a triangle of things. Sometimes it's longer, but very rarely. Like it's more like take a out of UK rather than being there.
Well, if you come to London, you let us know. You come
Yeah,
to,
I will
you
definitely.
come to
Hopefully,
visit us.
yeah, early summer, love June, right, with lots of light.
Guys, just an advice. I advise you to already grab your sandwich before the presentation starts. So it's better because you already have your lunch with yourself.
We'll be happy to share
Experiences.
if you accept.
Experiences of years of Anna Carla and I coordination of lunch.
Yeah.
That's true.
I have started out something so that eventually the others follow.
Tommaso, you did tell us when you think we can open.
Yes, these are all of them. They are vegetarian. I'm not sure. Not 100%, but this should be vegan.
Okay. There are no dead cows in there.
Hmm?
There are no
Okay,
dead
no.
cows.
Here
No,
online,
but I'm
there
thinking about milk or something, but there should be nothing.
Okay.
Yeah, it looks like,
Okay.
it's all vegetarian, yeah.
Good. You're never sure, but it's always good to. Okay.
all allowed to share, right, Shiam?
Yeah, I am allowed to. I checked also.
Great.
I'm allowed to share.
Perfect. Wonderful.
Which order do we go and how shall we structure? I'm sure you thought about all of that, but.
Great. So
Discussion on this.
then we will have to understand, Sasha, it's better if you speak from your mic or from the room because I can see it's a bit, there's a bit of an echo.
Well, my microphone is off.
We have all off.
Yeah.
But we don't hear
Later.
you very well. Yeah,
Yeah, later perhaps just to the,
Is the
exactly. Yeah.
Normally.
is the microphone
Ah.
good? I'm enjoying this. Well, you can.
It's better now, Anna.
I hear you very, very well, Tommaso, but I still don't hear very well,
You-
Sasha. So it can be
No,
that the
then-
audio of the Zoom is your computer instead of the mic.
Exactly.
Okay.
I can of course use my own microphone.
perfect. Then
That one would be complicated because we cannot hear. Let's try like this. Can you hear better now? If Sasha tried to speak now?
Yes, can you hear me better now?
Yes.
yeah, better. It's a bit far, but better.
Did you move
Better,
it?
not better.
Normally, yes. Because now it's there.
And you know where's the microphone? Is it on the top? Is it on the side?
No idea.
I think I still hear you better, Tommaso.
Yeah, you are, yes, in the best position,
But it's
Tommaso.
okay. I mean, we
Why
still hear.
It's
we
the
still
camera
hear
taking
Sasha.
because that stuff is not working as a mic. Is this camera here?
Ah, okay.
So it's a microphone in the camera.
Yeah.
Hello.
Okay, so I think we can
Nice.
start.
There
We
is
are
a nice
with,
group of people in person.
If you want space, if you want, maybe it's a better position from here.
I think
No,
I
no.
will introduce the
Better if this
The
is the
event.
mic.
No, I would say,
So-
okay, you mean.
Yeah.
I have muted the room if that's fine, so that we can welcome everyone. And people can continue, of course, joining the room and sit around the table and organize with the help of Tommaso, the setup. So welcome everyone again. As the majority of you knows already, this seminar is the first of the yearly spring open launches of the Habitat Research Center, where the 3 research fields of the HRC are open for discussions. Today, we will discuss healthy habitats, and we will move with the next event dedicated to the landscape and finally to the productive habitats. These kind of events and meetings are organized to offer opportunities for interdisciplinary discussions around urbanizations and to foster new collaborations within the EPFL scientific community and beyond. In the current situation in which we find ourselves, in the deep crisis of the current climatic regime, especially, and the past few years conditions that we all have experienced, the preservation of the quality of life represents a fundamental challenge to investigate the urban space future. And in this sense, urban space will need, therefore, to guarantee healthy, secure, and comfortable spaces to both live and work, as well as, work toward the preservation of fertile and healthy soils, and therefore healthy foods. And this is why we believe that this is a very important subject to keep the focus on and discuss. And today we would like to look at this subject, at this issue, and trying to address the questions of urbanization, climate change, and health, and what academia can do now. I am Elena Lunghin. For those who doesn't know me, I'm part of the HRC executive board. I am also a postdoc researcher at TU Delft, and I direct a summer schools at the EAA, which is called Cervella. And as I was saying at the beginning, I am here with a few of my colleagues at HRC, Anna Carla, Shyam, Anna Pagani also is half, if I can say, still half in this side of Europe. Sasha Nick is also one of our guests, is part of our network. Tommaso Pietropoli is the director of the center at the moment and is there with you in person. So I would like to briefly introduce our guests. As I anticipated and mentioned before, we are very, very happy to welcome Gemma Moore. Gemma is an associate professor and senior research fellow at the Institute for Environmental Design and Engineering at the Bartlett in London. Gemma, since 2002, undertakes research and teaching in the field of sustainability, participation, community engagement, health, and environmental quality. As part of this role, Gemma leads the MNC's module Health and Wellbeing in Cities, Theory and Practice for the Bartlett Institute of Environmental Design and Engineering's MNC's Health, Sustainability and Wellbeing in Buildings. Within the module, she has built a model of engaged teaching involving community and policy partners with the assessment. We are really, really happy to have you with us, Gemma, although the format of the event doesn't allow for a very long interaction, but we hope that this is just at the beginning of the exchange. As I mentioned before, there is Anna Pagani with us. Anna Pagani completed her PhD here at EPFL within the HERUS lab. She is and has been part of the HRC Healthy Habitats in particular executive board. Now she's at the UCL with a postdoc mobility fellowship as NSF, Housing, Health, Inequalities and Regeneration Project, which is the focus of her work, of her research. And we welcome again our colleague Sasha Nick, who's a doctoral assistant in the Laboratory of Environmental and Urban Economics at the EPFL, LEUR, researching societal transition pathways at the EPFL, and also teaching at the Business School in Lausanne and UNIL. So today we will hear about community collaboration supporting livable cities, with Gemma's presentation, who will show us examples of university roles in working with communities, drawn from her latest recently published book titled Co-Designing Infrastructures, Community Collaboration for Livable Cities. We will learn about the integrated systemic, interdisciplinary and spatial temporal approaches to address the complex relationship between housing, street and health through ANNA contributions, and the implications of rethinking spaces in multiple dimensions from both the perspective of research and stakeholders modeling and alternative approaches, thanks to Sasha's. We hope that this representation give us a transcalar sort of way of looking at the subject, as we think we understood the focus will be. The goal is to be very interactive, both from here and with you there, guys, in the room. Our presenters will have 15 minutes to present their work, and then if there's any questions, any doubt, directly linked, feel free to ask or to comment just after each of their presentations. And then we will have a roundtable discussions where we will exhort our discussants to exchange in reflection of what each of them has have presented. So I leave the floor to Gemma.
Okay.
And many thanks, Gemma, for
Thank you.
with us.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for that wonderful introduction. So I'm here because I've got the delight of now being connected to Anna. So I'm in the same department that Anna at UCL. So it's been really nice for Anna to invite me to your network and to get involved. And as you said, I'm going to explain actually a piece of work that isn't mine. It isn't like I've been involved in it, but actually is some work of myself and some colleagues based at UCL, but also of our community partners that we've been working with, who are residents and activists in London. And I'm going to respond to the question that you posed by actually provoking a different way that universities and researchers can work with communities. So a lot of what I'm going to say is from the book. So I'm delighted to have a copy here. We got it last week, and you can download it, and I'll put the details on my slides. So I know I've only got 15 minutes, so I'm going to put a timer on. But if anyone wants to follow up afterwards, please do. So I'm just going to put my timer on and share my slides. Okay. Hopefully this works. Let me know if it doesn't work. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So within the 15 minutes I've got, I'm just going to give a bit of context of my response to the question that was posed, as well as, I guess, pushing something that underlines the work that I'm going to share with you, which is this idea of accessing and bringing together different knowledges, and the fact that we should, in academia, consider the role of different expertise, not just within disciplines, but outside the disciplinary boundaries. So involving lived experience and the knowledge of communities that we're working with. I'm going to share a model of how universities can work with communities to tackle challenges and challenges that relate to the climate crisis and other crises that are happening. And that hopefully from my 15 minutes, there'll be a take-home message about the role of community collaboration and the power of how powerful knowledge is for action in terms of thinking about livable cities. So I just do a little bit about me. And so I've got a background actually in geography, although I'm based in the Institute for Environmental Design and Engineering. I feel a bit of an oddity in my department. I'm a social scientist. A lot of my work fits under the really broad umbrella of health and sustainability. But I guess what ties all my projects together is I'm really fascinated, and I encourage actually the, I guess, engagement of others in that process of knowledge production. So a lot of my work involves either working with residents around issues that are real to them, or with policymakers to try and embed research in policy. So that interface of knowledge and action is really important, and that's a common thread that runs throughout my work. So, starting with the question, of course, everyone in the room is aware that there is a complex combination of challenges that we are facing now, and also facing with increasing urbanisation, that are affecting cities. not only climate change, but that fragility with natural resources, a growing economic instability, and increasing health and social inequalities. And what we also know is there's a relationship between these different challenges. And we also know that these challenges are affecting us depending on who we are and our positions and our economic and social backgrounds differently. Because those who are living in poorer or are racially marginalised often experience impacts from air quality and noise and traffic and the loss of green space, and have increased exposure to issues resulting from climate change. And these communities also often receive little benefit from wider infrastructure projects or development projects that happen. So we also know, in light of these challenges, we understand they're interrelated, and we'll hear from Anna about how there's a growing shift in the need and awareness to take a systems perspective with trying to think of solutions to these challenges. We also know that to solve them, we have to work cross-sectorial. So there's a lot of talk in policy about silo thinking, and again, within academic disciplines, we need to come together. So I really liked Elena's point about this being an interdisciplinary space, because we need to work together because those issues are cross-sectorial. We also know that actually we can't rely on academic knowledge alone, that we need a range of expertise and knowledges to come together to tackle these problems. So participation and collaboration are emerging, and there's a real shift towards this more engaged practice. So thinking about, I guess, in the department I'm in, an engineering perspective, there's increasing questions on disciplines and professions to engage different stakeholders in technical designs or decision making, and this gives an opportunity for research to better respond to the societal and environmental issues, and doing that in a more democratized way. So a key idea and a key concept behind that is the role of knowledge democracy. And so reflecting on 4 decades of work in Africa, India and Canada, Hall and Tandon explain that knowledge democracy acknowledges the importance of the existence of multiple epistemologies and the knowledge of marginalised and excluded everywhere. So it's about understanding that knowledge is a powerful tool for taking action and for mobilising social movements to actually deepen democracy. But it's also about the open access and sharing of knowledge. So everybody who needs the knowledge has access to it, and everybody has that access to take part in decision making. So this is fundamental to the work that I'm presenting from my colleagues, and it links to a wider shift, because it's like, what, with the question that I was posed at the start, what can academia do now? This wider shift of thinking about the role of research, the role of universities, of being integrated and responding to real life challenges, and the fact that actually we should have impact, our research should have impacts, but our research should be influenced by issues on the ground. So what I'm going to talk about today, and where that all frames, is the book that I mentioned at the start, which is called Co-Designing Infrastructures, and it came out last week. And what it is really examples, a real how-to guide of thinking about how engineering and related researchers can work directly with grassroots communities on the ground, particularly communities who may not have access to particular knowledge or expertise in engineering, but actually the bringing together of different knowledges to tackle issues that communities are facing. And the intention of where it all came from was actually to support those communities with initially technical advice and analysis, enhancing their capacities to scrutinise the decisions that were happening to them and give them alternatives in their community. So equipping them with the knowledge to respond to wider development challenges happening on the ground. So it is based on a version of knowledge democracy, because it acknowledges that technical knowledge is important to decision making, And if so, technical knowledge needs to be widely accessible, and it needs to be based in the context of people who live there and bring in their lived experience. So rather than us being activists, actually we were considering ourselves as positions in working with others to bring about change as independent professionals working with a public interest. And the topics within the book cover small projects around air quality, energy efficiency, neighbourhood security, even thinking about things like access to transport. So there's 4 or 5 case studies in the book, but what we describe is different models for universities to work with communities. So underpinned by this idea of knowledge democracy. So we call these the 3 C's, and this is all about the nature of relationship between community groups and researchers and academia. And so within our relationship and the projects that we ran, we noticed this model of working evolved. It evolved from, first of all, thinking of the community as the client, but giving them free access to research expertise and technical expertise. But as the client, they would set the agenda. They would come to us with a problem they want solved and particular ask on what they would like help with. But then actually with different case studies that are shown in the book, we also had the idea of researchers being contributing, so us setting the agenda and involving communities in a particular project. But later on with our projects, it was much more mutually agreed of what the asks were and who was setting the goals. So I'm going to explain this because I realise that's quite abstract with one example, particularly starting with the first model of the community as the client. And so with this model, just from the diagram I put up, it shows that the client is the one that sets the scope of the project. The main outcomes are driven by and for the client, which is the community partner, and it's all set in the context of what is the issue that they're facing. And our roles as researchers are to respond to that, to negotiate the scope of the project, but any outcomes, be that research or academic outcomes, are secondary to the primary outcome, which is around the impact being on the project. So I realise I'm short of time, but I'm going to try to squeeze in one example of that, which was a project where we worked with residents in Somerstown. And so Somerstown is next door to UCL, and it's an area you literally cross the Euston Road, and it's got a rich history of social innovation and community action. So real in the heart of London, so next to 2 big stations, King's Cross and Euston. And it's a residential neighbourhood surrounded by big infrastructure, but it's also where the residents are living with some of the poorest air quality and the little access to green space, because it's a highly urbanised environment, so lots of social housing. And it comes up in the news, I think every time there's a mention of, I guess, the environmental determinants of health, because it's one of those examples where if you live one side of the Euston Road compared to another, there's a massive drop in life expectancy. So that's the headline, can 1 mile take 10 years off your life? So despite having this rich history of social action, it also is known for being an area where there's massive health inequalities. And over the last 20 years, this is an example, I think this is by King's Cross, but we've also got the High Speed 2, so big infrastructure projects happening. And over the last 20 years, it's been a continuous progression of construction projects in this area because of it's been targeted by regeneration and because it's good transport links. And residents had concerns over particularly the air quality issues, and they were concerned about decisions being made on their behalf by developers and the local authority. So they came to us with questions about those decisions, and I guess a disparity in their experiences against what they were being told about air quality levels in their neighbourhood. So they actually came to us with an ask around technical evidence to challenge particular policies and approaches. And this had led to distrust between the different actors and stakeholders involved. And there was even a distrust towards UCL, because that community had a long history of UCL of researchers going in and studying them, but rather than giving back to them, which is why we treated them like a client. So I'm gonna I've realized I've got a couple of minutes left, but what we did was undertake participatory workshops with them, focused on the issue of air quality. And we looked at some of the data that they had access to. And actually, they didn't have access to all sets of data. And our position being within UCL meant that we could request and get access to different data around air quality from the developers. Because there was lots of monitoring happening because of the wide infrastructure projects happening. So we knew there was monitoring happening, but not all the data was being shared because it wasn't all publicly available. There was also an issue that some construction projects were not continuously monitoring after they felt the construction had ended. So first of all, I guess we could see where we could contribute and we could help the residents to access some of those issues, data, and understand what happened. So what we did, we worked with a particular air quality specialist, and we undertook a technical review of the data that they had available. I guess crudely, this is my colleague Claire that was involved in this project, but crudely we found that there was a discrepancy of what the data should have been benchmarked against. They'd classified some areas as non-residential, so they had a higher baseline, and they were actually residential quiet streets. So this scrutiny that we provided enabled us to push back to the developer in HS2, a big infrastructure project, to push to say that actually these areas were being benchmarked against the wrong assessment, and they should change their bias factor adjustment factors, because the impact of the development was much more significant than what the data was implying. So the community pushed back against that. We also developed a clean air partnership to try and rebuild those relationships and to ensure that the community were around the table to be part of those decisions that were being made and would have access to that data. And so it was a real significant impact on those communities. And this is a quote from Claire, who was involved in that project. And Claire gave her expertise, had never worked in this way before. And I think the highlight from her work actually is that as a researcher, yes, she was used to scrutinizing air quality data, but had never worked in this engaged way. And it opened her eyes into the knowledge that the community have about their area. And so although she created a technical report, actually Claire went on to be to her work to be much more community focused, and so she was one of the expert witnesses for the Ella Adu Kisu-Debra case, which in the UK was a groundbreaking case with an inquest into Ella's death, and it was the first case that acknowledged that air pollution played a role in a child's death in South London. So Claire's work went on to be, I guess, much more socially engaged and thinking about how her expertise could contribute to community empowerment. So that was just the model in practice that we were set by the agenda of the neighbourhood forum in Somerstown, and our work provides recommendations to them with this evidence review. But aside from that, obviously, we learned about a co-design process working with them. We applied to our next project, and there were academic outputs from that. So I realise my time is up and the alarm went off, but I think it comes back to those ideas of what role could academia have. So that was in that question at the start. And I think it goes back to those ideas of knowledge being powerful and the power in sharing that knowledge to take action. And also this formation of collective knowledge, so we all have a role to play. And so that's why that participatory process is so important for building that relational capacity that was needed in terms of that project in Somerstown and also the examples within the book. And I think our work also raises a question about what we're training up our students to do. So students were involved in these projects as well, in terms of having a role to develop professionals in the built environment sector, so in engineering, in planning, and other design aspects who can contribute to solving the profound challenges that I started with in my talk. Okay, sorry I went on a couple of extra minutes.
Totally fine. Thank you, Gemma. I also we understand how it's difficult to squeeze all this in such a short time. So thanks also for the effort. I will welcome anyone who has direct questions or curiosity to just feel free to ask. Anyone in the room, perhaps, anything? Well, I will have you, Anna.
Yeah, this is linked to what I present, but let's discuss afterwards.
Okay, thanks.
Then I might have a direct question because it's a burning curiosity. Like, I think, thanks, Gemma. It's so interesting actually to hear about this work. Like, I'm looking forward to looking at the book. I downloaded that, but I haven't yet went through that. Like, when you say that residents came to you, I think, isn't there also something related to how we present universities, what universities do? Because I'm thinking sometimes people don't know that we are there, that we could be there for them. So do you also reflect upon this role of how universities are branded, or kind of how because maybe residents are in similar situations and they don't know that they could come to us and ask?
I think that's a really, really good question. And I just quickly touched upon that, say, with that example in Somerstown, there was a real negative relationship there because we were neighbours with that community and they were used to being studied. So actually, a lot of it was extractive. The relationship was extractive rather than mutually beneficial because they were studied because they are in a deprived area or because there was these mass health inequalities. So they were aware UCL was there because it's a neighbour and they're part of what's branded the knowledge quarter. They live in the knowledge quarter, but the relationship was quite negative. So there's that as well that involved the rebuilding. But you're right, if there is a lack of awareness of what resources the university could provide, that's another barrier. And I think adding to that is, well, at UCL, we do a very good job, and particularly in the Bartlett where we're based, so we're global #1 or whatever, that we present this, what we do present is quite arrogant at times. And so you do need to have that human face. So Sarah, who led this work, Sarah Bell, she spent time building that relational capacity. She set up the model. She created what was called the engineering exchange, where on that advisory group had resident groups. So she opened the door to start those conversations, because otherwise, you're right, what do communities see? Either nothing that don't know exists, or they see arrogance, or they just see somebody taking information from them, in that example of Somerstown. So yeah, there needs to be open doors in those relational capacities. So key.
Thanks, Gemma.
Thank you.
I also have questions, but I think we can perhaps have them all at the end. There's very specific things, but also in relation to the wider question. So for the time's sake, I will leave the floor to Anna to share her screen.
Thank you. I'll first move the slides here and share the screen. Voila. Okay. I will also be mindful about the time. I will be, voila. Are you seeing my screen? I think you do. Full screen now?
Great.
Okay, excellent. So, excellent. So here we are. So I'm gonna, as Gemma mentioned before in her presentation, I'm gonna give a perspective on how what can universities do when they look at these complex challenges, and how we can use what we call system lenses or a systems perspective in order to foster collaboration across these silos that were also mentioned before. And in order to present this, I'm gonna to answer to this question, I'm going to present a work that we did when I was still at HRC, which looks at the interrelationship between housing, the street, and health. So I don't have time to explain you into detail systems thinking, but I can tell that we could go back to the Greeks if we want to think of when it was born. But in particular, there is an important book that was published in 1972. It was written after a group of people sat basically all together in Rome, discussing about whether the limits of our planet were compatible with growth that they were observing. And this group was then, the research on that was led at the time by Forrester at MIT. And they literally rebuilt a model of the world with all of the interrelationship between different factors that structure our planet and the way in which we live. So we didn't have exactly that ambition, but we also gathered as a group of scholars. We were in architecture, public health, epidemiology, building engineering, demographics, medicine, geography, and urbanism, to try to see how we could address a different question, but how especially we could work all together to address it. And that question was looking in particular at the controversial relationship between housing and the street, which has evolved over time. If we think in the past about the insalubriness of medieval areas, residential areas, to then fresh air, light, etc., in status. And finally, back again, thinking about what air pollution, noise, and heat produced by the proximity with the street and how they affect health. So the study of housing and the street and health has been mostly done using traditional public health approaches that do not look at all these complex and evolving interrelationships. So they are temporal, they are spatial, they are conceptual interlinkages that haven't been explored. Sometimes they are by using what we call spatio-temporal research. However, when we look at these data, we use a specific framework for the analysis. And of course, the framework that we use exposes us to a certain extent to the siloed view of the system that we're looking at. And that's why in the work that we were doing, we were trying to propose a systemic research framework to address what you will see in the presentation, HSH, so housing, street, and health interactions. We adopted 6 perspectives. Basically, we were a group of scholars and we thought, okay, what is our expertise? Population health, architectural, building technology, socioeconomic and economic perspective, and then urban planning and legislative one. And we integrated them using a tool from systems thinking that is called causal loop diagram, but that we can more simply call maps. And these maps show the causal, so it's causal interrelationship between different factors, and that have been studied again by these very different perspectives. So I will not have time to describe you now exactly what an arrow means, what a loop exactly is, but I'm going to guide you through those so that you can still understand the way in which these maps work. So first of all, when looking at a population health perspective, this perspective mainly shows how indoor pollutants, outdoor pollution, noise, overheating all have an impact in different ways on the exposure to noise, air pollution, and heat that affect in many different ways health. And these effects are worsened by a population aging and the time spent at home, and of course by climate change, which is making even worse overheating and other aspects. But architecture also plays a role in that, because the closeness of the rooms to the street determines the exposure, how much we are exposed. If I sleep in a bedroom that is very close to the street, I'm going to be more exposed to noise, air pollution, and heat. And this, the position of those rooms relates to different factors. One is whether the street location was viewed as a status in the past compared to the courtyard. And if we think instead of today, whether this layout has been reevaluated or not, depending on the knowledge that architects have, and also sometimes the technical constraints. But architecture is not everything. We also have building technologies like air tightness of building envelope, access to air conditioning, sound insulation, etc. All of these can limit this pollution and the exposure. However, at the same time, they can have what you see in dotted lines, some unintended consequences. Because of course, air conditioning mean more energy consumption, which produces actually CO2 and contribute to climate change. Also, it can contribute itself to the urban heat island, or the air tightness of the building envelope can increase building overheating and indoor pollutants. So of course, also the study in that part, and many of my colleagues at IDE actually are looking exactly at those unintended consequences of these different technologies and solutions. But these technologies also need to be affordable. And in fact, here, the socioeconomic perspective shows the interlinkages between, let's say, the socioeconomic status of residents and their exposure to noise, air pollution, and heat. In fact, a worse health tend to lead to unemployment and make good quality housing less affordable. At the same time, we also know that the exposure to noise, air pollution, and heat indoors is not necessarily related to socioeconomic status, because also high socioeconomic status residents tend to prefer living in urban centers with often a lot of traffic and have their rooms close to the streets. So this is also quite an interesting point to explore. And there is a lot of debate on whether the coexistence of these different residents brings to more inequalities. And here we go to the housing prices perspective, where again, inequalities are shown here, especially in housing prices. Because in fact, the exposure, the better the air quality, the less we're close to a street, the higher the housing prices. And the higher the housing prices, the more there tends to be a displacement of low socioeconomic communities. At the same time, we know that when there is a presence of wealthier, let's say, household, neighborhood qualities and amenities tend to be better, reducing burglary and robbery and creating a more safe community. But also the sense of community is a bit torn between the two things, because still it is still open to debate whether mixity is good or bad for that. Had a long discussion about this yesterday. And lastly, the last perspective is urban planning and the legislative one. This means accessibility of public transport, soft mobility infrastructure, local green spaces, street aesthetics. All of these contributes to reducing the main factor like air pollution, noise, heat outdoors. And at the same time to foster a stronger sense of community, to encourage physical activity and safety, and eventually have an impact on health. So when we look at the map altogether, we can see, of course, how all of these perspectives can be integrated, but as well, we can see what we call reinforcing and balancing loops. So how certain dynamics reinforce themselves or balance themselves. And in particular, we can see, as mentioned before, exposure leads to less health, more unemployment, less affordability of housing technologies, eventually reinforcing the exposure. And even if we were trying to reduce this exposure, this would have an impact on housing prices, leading to the displacement of low socioeconomic communities and eventually affecting their health, made worse by these two reinforcing dynamics of economic unemployment, time spent at home, etc. Which is why right now at UCL, I'm working on this project called A Just Transition Towards Housing Sustainability. So trying to reconcile this world of architecture and systems thinking to see how to go towards housing justice. So in a nutshell, how you can make this, can you implement it? Well, you can think about looking at the city via different data layers, one with housing prices, environmental condition, demographic and health, and how basically when looking at these different data layers, we can see interactions between those and patterns, and reevaluating them, looking at the maps, reevaluating both the causal linkages and the way in which we interpret them. So in this last minute, just what does this mean? So basically, when we visually display the state of the art, we can support the construction of research agendas within universities. We can have a more holistic understanding of our research findings. But in order to do that, we also need to take into account that what I've just shown you was on a specific, like the results of a specific research in Europe that would need much more literature review, empirical explorations, and in particular, as Gemma mentioned, this should be done in a transdisciplinary fashion. So engaging not only research stakeholders, but also non-research stakeholders, I mean, non-academic stakeholders in data collection and the validation of these maps. Of course, academia can benefit immensely from that, because it can really, adopting this perspective means being able to integrate knowledge that is really scattered around different fields, in terms, and better understand these housing, street, and health interrelationship, their evolution over time and space, and the effect of potential interventions. But also from a practitioner's viewpoint, we could really map the health of our cities, creating common ground for discussion at different levels of policy makings, and raising public awareness of risks and opportunities related to these interactions. Perhaps people are not aware, of how their bedroom located to a street can represent risks for their health, a risk for their health. And lastly, implement also existing research agendas, so support the implementation of existing ones. Thank you very much for listening.
Many thanks, Anna. I'm welcome again, anyone who wants to intervene from the room, to feel free. I'm trying to unmute you, but I can't from here. I'm sure Shyam has the control of it.
Unmute me, so now you can hear me
Okay.
now, I don't know.
Yes, now I do.
Yes.
If there's not anyone that wants to jump in right now, because I see
Oh,
time
yes.
is running, and
Yes,
we're
of
really.
course.
You have
always-
Sasha?
Yeah, I always have to react. Anna has always such wonderful ideas. So of course, this somehow assumes that the street is an ugly, filthy, polluted place, which of course it is. But that is not God-given. That is just because we tolerate cars and all sorts of other bad things on the street. So wouldn't that be a much better way to actually start? But also the fact that the streets are so ugly that no human can go into them, and only cars and tanks can go there. That is also a reinforcing loop that you could add to your model.
Absolutely.
But it could be key to breaking it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There was this study by the Space Syntax that was actually showing, we cited in this paper, that shows actually how street aesthetics really has an impact on all of this, like whether it's pleasant to go, how it is to go. And of course, again, this is very important because the more pleasant, the more people go and the more it becomes pleasant, etc. So it was really showing, actually analyzing the street layout, the street lighting and all of that, and seeing how this had an impact on robbery, burglary, etc. And it was a super interesting study. And so we've tried to kind of add up that part, but it's a map that could be expanded indefinitely. That's what I'm trying also to convince the reviewers about. Say, well, but they just send the reviews of the paper, say, we're missing this. Well, of course we're missing all of this. but it's okay. Now I'll leave you the floor, Sasha. I will not take more time on this. But thanks for the question.
Thanks, Anna. I see that there are some things that we could discuss. For example, the necessity to turn this into, hopefully in the near future, into proper regulation, like building regulations. So, and also that how this can have a value in the way in which developers and the real estate market values the buildings that we construct now. So how we can replace the value of certain things that we give at the moment into certain other factors that are totally, and here is connected to what Gemma was saying, to the democracy of knowledge. So how we can reconnect, reconcile this in order to shift values and also, of course, construct policies that follows this. So now we'll leave the floor to Sasha, because we are really, really running out of time, and I want you free to have the time to discuss together and with you. So Sasha, please feel free to share the screen.
I will start immediately. Just before I start, how much time do I have? Do I have 12 or 15 minutes? Just so that whatever, I know what time I'm exceeding.
Well, given that we have still like 23 minutes, if you would be great to like master to squeeze everything into 12 would be amazing, so that we have more time after. And I will ask everyone if maybe we can add 5 minutes and we can make this event 5 minutes longer if we are all available and catch up with time a bit.
For me, it's fine, 5 minutes more. Okay, good. So do you have my 15 minutes? I promise I will be somewhere between the two. Okay, so this started as a thought experiment, like a really ambitious, unrealistic thought experiment trying to solve all problems. And but actually, we built a model based on the first ideas, and the model shows that it could actually be a basis for strategy. So here it's a thought experiment. If we have a moratorium on new buildings for the rest of the century until 2100, what would happen? And the result is many good things happen. Specifically, we looked into can it help us reach net zero, improve social inclusion, and not just stop, but actually reverse urban sprawl, turn it back a century. And we can reach all of these things within a bit more than a decade. It's amazing. So let me show you the concept, the analysis, the model, and where to take this forward, because it's really a relatively new thing. I've been working in this for a few months, and I had a student spend 4 months building a model and testing the model. So then let me jump straight into this. Of course, you know all of these curves. I'm not going to dwell much on them, but the overall emissions of Swiss buildings are down about 15% in 30 years, which is first not nearly sufficient rate of improvement, but actually there's a positive story. That's the orange line, that emissions per square meter have gone down 55%, but the square meters are going up, and that is the big problem. Also urban sprawl is a complete and total and unmitigated disaster. And it's tripled in about 80 years. But the most alarming thing is that it is accelerating. It is not stopping or even decelerating. It has been accelerating for the latest period. So this line has a steeper slope than the previous one. And of course, this is a perfect positive feedback loop where more sprawl leads to more road building, and more road building leads to both habitat fragmentation and also even more building. So also there's all sorts of positive feedback loops around cars, and all of them are very bad for humans. This is a very interesting paper, which you probably know. Perhaps some of your colleagues are also somehow involved in this policy analysis of how to get housing within planetary boundaries. And basically, it is just for England, not even for all of UK. It concludes that with existing policy, housing will basically take up all the remaining budgets. And the most important issue, of course, affordability, that's what we all work on, but especially reducing demands for homes as financial assets and so on. But basically, it's a financial problem. Houses should not be a source of profit. And as long as they are, the problem cannot be fixed. Okay, so that kind of sets the stage. I won't discuss this, you know this stuff probably quite well, but this, I would like to share, this is my own analysis, which looked into current Swiss energy consumption per capita. So this is final, including imports, 6,200 watts per person continuous. This is preliminary data. We will have much better data in about a year and a half. It's going to take a bit of time to get much better data, but the reality is it's going to be plus minus 20% of this. So the orders of magnitude are good, but the breakdown is only partial. So we use 6,200 watts, which is an absurd quantity of energy. Of course, you all know that. But so we looked into what would an efficiency only, a perfect efficiency only strategy bring. And that means replacing every single heating, building, appliance, window, heat pump with the best one you can buy on the market today. That is, of course, relatively unrealistic to do in any reasonable period of time, but again, it's a thought experiment. Sufficiency doesn't require anything than changing behavior and mindset, and that means in a week, we could get, by changing behavior, we could get the consumption down by a factor of 5. And of course, if you could combine efficiency and sufficiency, you could get down the factor of 12. Now, efficiency, either the perfect one or the perfect one combined with sufficiency, is not feasible because that would require replacing every technical device. But of course, you could replace the 20% worst ones for an 80% effect. So probably the realistic number here, this is decent living standard, which is a big scientific body of work. Probably it's going to be around 600 to 700 watts for Switzerland, which is exactly a tenth of what we're using today. Okay, so that's the potential. And now I have to cite some wonderful work, which of course you know very well. What are the obstacles to reducing floor space? And I'm not going to comment because you know this paper much better than me. So I move on to climate action. And the climate action, really getting to net zero, is the sum of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, where 1, 2, and 3, and to a certain extent 4, is reducing emissions, and 5 is removing them, removing the excess carbon from the air. We know that with good nature-based solutions, 5 can amount to about 10% of today's emissions. So that means 1, 2, and 3 need to be about 90%. And given how much time we have, or how little time we have, 1 is by far the biggest piece. So sufficiency should account for well over half, perhaps 2/3 of the saving. Of course, you can find sufficiency in our analysis, but you cannot find it anywhere in public policy. And that is of course a big issue. So this is all very general. So let me jump straight into our own analysis. So first of all, what is it that we try to solve? We try to solve these 6 problems. These are the issues: ecosystem destruction, habitat destruction and fragmentation, fossil fuel, also climate lock-in, which has additional problems beyond fossil fuel. The households are becoming smaller and apartments are far too big for them. Light and air quality, just as you mentioned, Anna, is far from perfect, and all sorts of social inclusion problems. And all of these 6 problems not only can be solved together, but I would postulate that they cannot be solved separately, that you have to solve them together. And so these are our specific goals. Energy and climate, so buildings, without counting mobility between buildings, consumes 320 petajoules for Switzerland and emits about 12 million tons of CO2. We can go from this 320 petajoules down to about 45. That's quite a big factor, and it's actually very similar to the ratios that we have seen on the theoretical chart for decent living standards of efficiency and sufficiency. And we can decarbonate, we can basically go to almost no CO2. We can get the material flows from 50 million tons. This comes from the latest circularity report for Switzerland, which is 1/3 of all material flows of Switzerland linked to housing. That can go down by a factor of 10. It could possibly go down by a factor of 100, but it could certainly go down by a factor of 10. We could get the urban sprawl back a century. We could get it back to the level where it was in 1935. And I don't yet have the proof of this. This is actually being calculated. I hope to have it in about a month or 6 weeks. But the first estimate is that this is what we could do. We could ensure inclusive access to good living space for all. We could get rid of most car travel, and we could reduce overall the cost. And this is cost to society. So that means number of people working, how much materials, how much energy. So these are nice goals. The question is, how do we, it's hard to disagree with the goals. The question is, how do we do that? And here's the vision. So the building moratorium is the starting point of public policy. It starts from from the realization that we have far too much building area. So we have 46 square meters of residential area. We only need 20 if you're very generous. The DLS literature has a range of 10 to 20, but most estimates are between 10 and 40, 15 square meters per person. So we have 3 to 4 times too much space. Of course, population will grow between now and 2100, so you need to take that into account, but it won't grow that much. So the construction sector, of course, cannot do any more new building if you have a moratorium. So some people will quit, and those who remain can only renovate. So we are planning here in this thought experiment, and this is what we modeled, is to get to energy class A. So today, 5% of Swiss buildings are of energy class A, and 95% are not. We would get all of them to the energy class, energy efficiency A, get rid of oil and gas for heating. Very importantly, we would change the type of spaces. We would go from 2 types of space to 3, from public and private to public, shared and private. And that changes completely how we could possibly think about buildings. And we could also repurpose buildings so that we have all the essential services in every neighborhood, limiting the needs. This would still produce about 40% of excess buildings. And if you choose them well, you could actually demolish them. And this is the mechanism by which we would reverse urban sprawl. Let me move on to the space discussion. So the starting point, I start from the top. The starting point is that we have 46 square meters per person of living space. To that, we add 9 square meters of corridors and staircases, and 3 square meters of secondary residences. This is the latest data in 2021 for Switzerland. And then we have non-habitable space. So this is offices and hospitals and administration and shops and stuff. But it doesn't count industrial buildings or agricultural buildings. So this total is 73 square meters per person. And we plan to go from 73 square meters per person down to about half, to 34 square meters. And the 3 types of space will go to 20 square meters residential, 4 square meters corridors and staircases and stuff like that, and 10 square meters of services, shops, hospitals, etc. So today we have 2 types of space: private 46, public 14. We move from this to the private and shared together of 24 square meters, slightly less for public, but this is the average. The way we should actually think of it is what happens physically. And it will be about 5-6 square meters private space for you. That is space per person that only one person uses and no one else has access to. And then you have to say for 20 people, an area of perhaps 380 square meters. And these are all the dining rooms, guest rooms, all the stuff that you share in various configurations. Could be some small kitchens, some big kitchens, little dining room, big dining rooms. 380 square meters is quite a lot. So instead of having 2 types of space, there would be 3. And this is not something we invented. This comes actually from a series of workshops we did with stakeholders. And interestingly, all of them converged on the idea of 3 types of space, not 2. This is really the most important thing. So there's a bunch of assumptions here for our model. The most important one is this one in the middle. One worker can renovate 99 or 100 square meters per year. And this is what the model gives us. So the model, our model shows that instead of taking 125 years to renovate everything at a 0.8% annual renovation rate, we can get this down to 13 years, which is an order of magnitude better. And the bottleneck, so this is empty buildings, unrenovated buildings that go down. And then these here, the light blue are the newly renovated buildings that we use. And then the red buildings are the empty buildings, some of which will be abandoned. and demolished, and some of them will be kept for future population growth. There's a sensitivity analysis that shows that if we start in 2025, by 2038, the building stock is finished, remodeled, everybody has access to high quality living at a low cost and net zero. It has some sensitivity with reasonable assumptions. The process is finished between 2033 and 2046. So that's the basic thing. There's of course a bunch of open questions that we haven't solved. We did a simplified material analysis, but we need to go into a bit more detail. What will be the impact of the electric grid of focusing of having more density of people per area? Probably none, but we haven't done the analysis. We also think could we use some of the buildings from demolition for renovation? We don't have an answer to that. Also, which buildings should really be demolished and how to restore ecosystems in the best way? And then a bunch of questions around transition, such as policy instruments, acceptance, and how to prevent powerful people today who may not like this from subverting this. And I finish really with this, and I would very much like to have your discussion, ideas, etc. And I think I took about, what, 13, 14 minutes?
Thank you, Sasha. Thanks. This is very much tied to the question I was slightly opening up with Anna before about how to move from these researchers and to concrete policies. It seems to me that amongst all your three presentations that they vary in scales and focus, but still the role of knowledge democracies, as Gemma has beautifully phrased, is very central. The accessibility and transferability of knowledge, and how much of the knowledge we produce in academia is transferable, understandable, and then becomes tool for communities to take action, to choose. And also in the case where there is no spaces for choosing, how they can repositionate the tools that currently we use in planning and in constructions. So I will open the discussion to you three, and I would like to keep as a focus in mind and try to somehow with us envision a way from your expertise and how we can, therefore, also thinking about Gemma's presentation, how we can concretely construct a research, of course, unit that can actually activate these things directly with communities, exactly as you, Gemma, has shown. So we have discussed with Anna previously the fact that, especially the PFL, there's a lack of focus on the subject, and there's a lack of methodology in how to do this. So it would be important to hear what are your visions or your suggestions of how you would envision this for the future to happen.
Yeah, perhaps I also have a question for Gemma based on this, which is really our last line here, which is how do you really make this democratic for a neighborhood? You have a certain number of general principles, but the specific decision should be democratic and local. And with that, I would like to stop sharing and ask you, Gemma, what do you think?
Yeah, because that line, I was taken by that line in your presentation. I thought that was really interesting, and I guess it's something that I haven't really touched upon, because it's about the policy process as well, because I was touching upon how the university, an example of our model was universities working with communities, but there's that other aspect to it, which is that opening up of the policy process. And I think that's another area where we could play a role, but I guess we've gone in terms of the example I gave, is working and responding to the community being the client, requesting assistance with a particular issue, and then in that example, challenging I guess, challenging benchmarks of how things were being monitored and the sharing of data. But I think there's a separate role, which is about opening that was my reflection for that comment, opening the policy process up to ensure different forms of evidence go into that, and it is more open. So how do you get evidence into that policy process? And I don't know if you have a reaction back to that idea of going that way as well, if that makes sense. I'm kind of visualizing a Venn diagram.
Yeah, but perhaps this is closer to Anna's area. I don't know if you'd like to add something, Anna.
I see both actually. It's actually, wow, reacting to all of this content, like the brain starts going in all directions. I agree that there is a relationship with the client, I mean, with communities as client, and how what it means in terms of policy. And when I think, however, yesterday when I had this workshop with housing associations yesterday, and I was looking at all of these people discussing about housing, and then you look at them and you think, after all, they're all people. You know, we talk a lot about power dynamics and all of that. They were absolutely normal people that just, you know, try to do their job and like trying to, and so to a certain extent, policy, I don't want to say something that maybe is absolutely wrong, but the extent to which we can consider policymakers as well as communities and as our clients, like as a type of community to work with. And when we talk about democratic, like that term that also was there in your presentation, in both of your presentations, the extent to which actually these policymakers are, you know, not like, well, there are communities and then there is the policymakers, but they're also inhabitants. So they're also part of that decision process as when they are called to vote, basically. That so I kind of, I don't know whether that exercise, whether Gemma, in your research, actually, when you work with communities, those communities were actually perhaps the inhabitant itself was also considering, I mean, we're also including policymakers, and in that democratic process, Sasha, that you talk about, the extent to which, since it's going to affect policymakers themselves, how they can actually be, I mean, respond as residents as well, you know.
I guess, like, just thinking back on the example of the Somerstown, I think they felt things were being done to them, like that, those residents, so they were so separate from, they saw policymakers probably not as humans, and not, as you say, not as like completely separate. But I'm more reflecting actually about the Cush project I'm involved in. So I'm involved in a project that is much more around engagement with policy process around complex urban systems for sustainability. And that one, my reflections of that is, if I think about those two projects, the co-designing infrastructure and the Cush one, both of them is about this understanding the cultures of evidence use and how evidence is being used. So, and I wonder if that's with the housing association work you're doing, it's understanding what evidence, or what would they be open to this modeling and this data coming in, and how can they use that to bring about action? And I think we need to understand both of those. Maybe that's the common thing that we need to understand, that system of how do they have these cultures or subcultures of what knowledge and evidence is being used to support that decision making. I think maybe that is the common thread.
Yeah, but perhaps I can also add something on Anna's point of policymakers part of the community or not. In the theories of human need, participation is really defined as being involved in decisions that affect your life. And in the sense that many of these decisions are made by people whose lives are not affected, then they are not part. They should not be counted. And in that sense, we should really have much more local governance, and policy should really be more local. Now, of course, we still need anything that touches on the planetary boundaries. You still need to coordinate that. You can't have a different net zero policy for every commune, otherwise we'll never get to net zero. So at some point you need to have a coordinated constraint on biodiversity, impact on climate, and all these things that are planetary boundaries. But everything else should really be much more local. And I don't think we need some faraway parliament deciding on how how neighborhood should be organized.
Yeah.
But we may need to have some kind of overall decision how much energy everyone can use. Because if everybody decided for themselves, then for some communities we might end up using 10 times more energy than others, and that would be both unfair and would fail the energy transition.
And if I can react to that, Sasha, when you were presenting, I was thinking about something, because I see places where, you know, originally I'm from Italy, where property is something that is so entrenched. And also now that I'm in London and looking at the housing market, like the idea of owning one's house, of being homeowner, of actually, and also all the debate about who owns the land. Like if we start this discussion, we will never end. Like, but just in your idea of this moratorium, you're going towards less and less and less private space. So it means that it's also a redistribution of land and a redistribution of ownership. And this has to be democratic, as you say. And I'm wondering what type of cultural change you need in order to reach a democratic, you know, in the sense that people would, in that process, accept such a change, you know.
Right. Yeah. This is of course a difficult question. I don't think I really have an answer. But the whole idea of private property is quite an absurd idea. Now, owning land, the idea that one human could own a piece of the earth or all of the earth is completely absurd. And I think any society that doesn't somehow prevent that will fail and ultimately go extinct, because it is such an absurd idea. Now, whether people should own the window, whether people should own the shirt, I don't think it matters. What matters is what kind of governance, because in the end, you can't really own anything. It's an absurd concept. But the question is, what does this mean for governance? So we could either try to somehow change the concept of ownership, or we could simply say we don't touch ownership. It doesn't matter. Ownership is not linked to the ability to act on something. So you may own a house, but you don't decide anything about the house. So owning is just something that's on paper somewhere. But the fact that someone who just happens to have money, which itself doesn't exist, could make decisions that affect society's resources is absurd. I don't think a well-functioning society can work on this basis. So, for example, one good example is the wetlands in Switzerland. So,
which
of course,
one,
wetlands in Switzerland. So wetlands are in very bad shape, and a small number of them, about 15 square kilometers, have been protected by a law 30 years ago. And the law didn't change who owns the land. The law just defined what you're allowed to do on the land and what you're not allowed. And basically, you're not allowed to do anything, because you need to leave it in a natural state. So you don't change property relationships. I think the better way is to remove any meaning of property, remove all governance from property, remove the ability to extract rents or value appropriation linked to property. If you can do all of that, then property could still remain on paper. It will become meaningless. And after a decade or two of meaningless property, you could strip away the concepts. I think it's better to do it that way than to actually start a nationwide debate, should we have property or not. That was my impression. But you clearly need to take away the ability to use property as a basis for governance.
And I'm wondering, in the example of Gemma, the extent to which actually the fact that residents claim their rights to say, well, this is wrong, we need someone that come here, etc. Isn't it a way of actually claiming that, you know, their rights and related to a feeling of belonging or owning, but in a positive way, so without that ownership relationship?
Yeah, I was just thinking, I was just reflecting on my interpretation of the discussion, and I was thinking about elements of control. And there's been some programs here, I think, relate to that the question that you mentioned about, I guess, giving out giving up power, giving up decision making. And I think they're seen as a bit of experiments here in the UK. And there's examples of, there's one study called Communities in Control. And it's interesting because it goes back to the start of this, which is that health angle. What's the health impact as well? Not just of tackling issues about air quality or issues about property. What are the impacts of handing over control? Because there's health benefits and there's a health also negative things of giving that over. And I think there's a theory, I think it's by Wallerstein, which looks at health as like the impact of empowerment on health or powerlessness on health and how that has a health consequence to it.
Mhm.
So that was, I think when you were talking, that was my reflection about that aspect of control. And there's a longitudinal study of communities where they're making decisions over neighborhood level programs around infrastructure and other things, but the study is what's the impact of having that control and that power. And it's not always ultimately a positive thing, I think, because participation is messy, and because within participation there's power dynamics, and I think some of communities were uncomfortable. So it's a fascinating study, and it's by, I can send over the links. It's by I think the team's led by Jenny Poppé over here in the UK, and it's really interesting. It goes back to that health angle which we started with. That was just, I know it's not directly, as my brain's probably like Anna's. It was when you were talking, I kept thinking back to that aspect of it.
Yeah.
We are probably coming to a point where we will need to wrap this up. But I very much like what you said, Gemma. In the end, it's about agency, and agency is of course very much linked to many human needs. So that's very important. How could the three of us and whoever else in this community is interested in collaborating do so going forward? You know, one of the most obvious things that I was thinking of, if we are going to move from what we have today, like this here, from this configuration of private and public space to this kind of configuration, by remodeling existing buildings, we will need all the fantastic architects we have in our schools and elsewhere to actually help us do that. And I'm not an architect, but Anna is.
Anna is, yeah.
So Anna, can you help us? How do we create a real architecture project to make sense? I mean, I draw little boxes here, but this is not very nice. If you actually give this to a real architect, I'm sure they could do a much better job.
Good question. There will be an infinite way to answer to that. I think there is also very nice examples of how this is done, like in certain housing cooperatives that you might know better than me, perhaps, Sasha, like the Coda and all of this cluster type of housing is a way that is bringing the private space smaller and smaller, more and more shared spaces. In from that point of view, the question is how to take existing housing stock, and particular even the one that is called hard to decarbonize, that is like, I see the quality of homes also around where I live, and like how to transform this one, that is a completely, but I think that in order to do that, we also need to accept new models of what households and families are, from the traditional model of normal parents and children, which is still there and is important that it is, but in parallel also accepting as a kind of other types of families, like living in flat shares, even adult flat shares, and so on and so forth, as other models of families that in certain countries are a bit harder to accept than in others. I think this is one fundamental point that comes even before or together with the design, most probably.
Right. Well, it's social and space design together.
Yeah. Yes, it is.
So how do we collaborate? I mean, this is great. We have lots in common, and we couldn't cover everything in this hour and something.
Yeah, there will be so much more to discuss, actually. I think first the starting of reflecting, I mean, thinking about how that would be. I mean, while you were both speaking, I was thinking about so many things that I'm discovering via my interviews. So I will brainstorm about this on my side.
Well, and as you and I talk regularly, we could discuss that some other time. But Ellen, I have a question for you. Last year we had like a whole HRC day in the beginning of July. I don't know if anything similar is being.
Yeah,
planned.
I was in fact about to tie this necessity to expand the conversation to that event. There will be on the 4th of July. Tommaso, correct me if I'm wrong. I have a
3rd of July, we discussed briefly,
Sure.
we are checking availabilities, but there should be the same event happening beginning of July. With a slightly changed, adjusted program compared to what we did last year.
Okay, Monday, the 3rd of July.
Yeah, and once we fix with some non-European partners that should confirm the presence, we will be out with a draft program, let's say, to all of you.
Okay, don't wait too much because 3rd of July is very soon.
Yeah, we know.
And agendas are filled.
Yeah, that's why we're planning to do something different instead of having one yearly very relevant moment to spread this and to divide, because we realized that also last year that was not that it was not possible to cover everything in one afternoon. So the idea is rather to have a series of events in the next few months, trying to
Okay.
resume what we have been here just around.
Because perhaps some of the discussions we had today, perhaps we could somehow summarize that and use that as an input or a starting point, and then have people discuss. I don't know, we need to think about this, but
Yeah.
it's clearly interesting material.
Yeah.
here.
Yes, it is, and I'm so sorry that we are already late because also I would have many questions for all of you, and I assume also people from EPFL's room, but we have to close this up, unfortunately. So I just want to thank a lot, Gemma, for being with us, and we hope to have you joining us again very soon, perhaps for the July event if you have some time. And of course, Sasha and Anna. And I just want to invite you to follow or participate in any forum to the next launches dedicated to the landscape habitat, which will take place on the 23rd of May, and will be followed by the third one later on in early June. So yeah, so thank you everyone, and hope to see you soon here or in person.
Thank you, everyone.
Before
Nice
we
to meet
close,
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very
Bye.
much.
let's just thank everybody here in the room. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Really.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.
Sorry, Sasha.